Welcome, everyone. It's a privilege to be here with you, with my colleagues, who I will introduce in a minute, to discuss advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and access or accessibility in human participant research. Next slide. What I can say is that we cannot do this alone. We need the community. We need you together. We need you to help us, and we need to help one another do this work. And therefore, we're really thrilled that you could be here and join us today. My name is Barbara Beer. I'm from the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. But I want you to know that the opinions are not are those of the presenters and not of the organizations that we represent. The MRCT Center itself is supported by voluntary contributions and grants, and which you can read here. And we are, and each of us are committed to autonomy in our research and transparency in our relationships. You will receive a survey in the next 2 days or on Monday about this seminar and how we can develop further resources for your work. Please do fill it out. And I want you to know that we will post a recording of the seminars and the slides, as well as the bios of the individual speakers today. I don't want to spend time giving their extensive introductions. Next slide. So today you're going to hear from myself. I'm the Barbara Beer. I'm the faculty director of the MRCT Center. From Ivy Tillman, who is the executive director of PRIM&R. From Michelle Feiga, who is the executive vice president of AAHRPP. And from Martha Jones, who is the vice president of human research affairs at the Mass General Brigham. Now, when we talk about this work, and we say that IRBs, ethics committees, and human research protection programs, or HRPPs, have a role in diversity, inclusion, and equity. What we often hear is, well, that's scope creep. It is not in the regulations. It is beyond our remit. We don't have a role here. That by the time we see the protocols come to us, really those protocols are baked. But we think, next slide, please, that that the regulations are the floor and justice is the goal. And that our responsibility is to balance protection with inclusion. We've been biased towards protections of human research participants, and we now really have to think about inclusion. Next slide. The idea behind clinical trials and clinical research is that they should reflect the population affected by the condition or disease, or for whom the intervention is intended. Currently, our trials don't do that. I am not going to show the data for that, but we can show it to you if you need to be convinced. I don't think any of us here need to be convinced. And when we're talking about diversity, could I have the next slide? We're talking about all diversity: race, ethnicity, age, sex, gender, sexual orientation, language, religion, ability, culture, social determinants of health, etc. So this is not meant to be exclusive to any one population, but really to reflect the population affected by the disease or condition. Could I have the next slide? So our objective today is to talk about where to start, to explore the resources and tools that are already available for you to use and adapt, to identify those resources that would be helpful to build, and that's where we're depending on you, to hear strategies for advancing inclusion in research, and then to engage all of you in a common goal. Could I have the next slide? And you'll see that the MRCT Center has developed a suite of DEI resources for IRBs, HRPPs, and investigators, as well as for participants to adapt or use. And we're offering these, hoping that you'll take them, make them better, use them, and proceed. Could I have the next slide, please? So ideally, we always think about where do we start on this journey, and we'd posit that you should know your IRB, the HRPP, your own institution, community, and friends. You need allies in this journey, and you need people that will support your efforts. I think it's then important to plan what you intend to do, to communicate what you intend, and then to provide resources that are available to the community that you expect to respond. And then, as always, it's hardest to get new resources in this world, but sometimes it is necessary to garner resources that are necessary for the change that you wish to see. But first, do what we can do, knowing what we know. Could I have the next slide? So where do we start? And one of the things that we'd like to know, and please think about through this seminar, is how can we help? You've got the AAHRPP, PRIM&R, the institutions represented by Mass General Brigham together, wanting to share the resources we develop. You should tell us what else you need. So that's part of why we're here today. Could I have the next slide? So we've done at the MRCT Center a fair amount of work on this. We have a pretty comprehensive initial presentation of advancing diversity, inclusion, and equity in clinical research, which you can download. In it, there's also a toolkit presented not only as a PDF, but also as an accordion. Each of these toolkit sections has multiple tools within it. So we invite you to look at that, download it. There's some overview and then participant and community engagement, issues of participant awareness, knowledge, and access, workforce training, data variables, collection and reporting, study design, conduct, and implementation, stakeholder commitments, and then some case studies for you to read and appreciate. I'm not going to send or go through all of those resources today. I'm just going to highlight the ones for the IRB, HRPP, and some of the efforts that we've done on behalf of investigators and participants. Next slide. So as we said, we think that you should start with sort of thinking through what your commitment is to DE&I and propose some statements of commitments for the IRB and HRPP of varying lengths. That, of course, has to be looked at in collaboration with your institution. Could I have the next slide? We then think it would be wise to start with an IRB self-evaluation so that you really understand how the membership of your IRB or HRPP, depending on how extensive you make this, think about their representation and what their needs are, what the skill development's needs are, what the training is. And what we've done is take a group of questions for institutions, HRPPs, and or IRBs to select or adapt. All of this is, of course, presented as a model template, and we want you to make it your own and better. Could I have the next slide? We are concerned that IRB members need support, particularly if you're inviting people that are not been traditionally part of your institution to be IRB members. They need the support to do this correctly. And that includes digital access, virtual working environment with accommodations, recognition and reward, compensation. People that are not part of the institution should be compensated for their service on an IRB, and some institutional policy recommendations. Could I have the next slide? Additionally, we have gone through two of the templates that are available. One is the NIH, FDA, and Translatorate template for interventional trials, and then the NIH template for social behavioral trials, and annotated both of those for diversity, inclusion, equity considerations to really prompt one to think about the kinds of issues that should be addressed in the protocol if you plan initially for diversity, inclusion, and equity. We offer that, hoping that you'll go through your own protocol templates if you have them and begin to revise them for consideration of DEIA issues. Next slide. We then went through an IRB health literacy checklist. As you know, any participant facing materials should be in plain language, and we've given you best practices for health literacy and how to think about that. It applies to all participant-facing materials, and then there is also a training appended to that. In addition, next slide, there is tools and resources for learning how to express oneself in a health literate way, and really hoping that you'll share these with your investigator and your protocol writers. Incrementally, on the next slide, we have a plain language glossary, which is being revised now there and will be presented on April 2nd. And that is for participants as well as for investigators to use terms in a way that is consistent across institutions and in a way that helps people to understand. Further, we've reviewed and revised and crafted all of the images so that you can use those at will. Next slide. It is also a CDIS standard now, so that in the same way that this is trying to come up with an aligned glossary to use, these are words that have been accepted and are available for you. Next slide. So we've gone through the diversity, inclusion, equity issues and thought through at each of the parts of a protocol, a patient journey, pre-study, on-study, and post-study. What are the kinds of things you should be thinking about, or your investigators should be thinking about to make sure that it's set up for access to those that have been traditionally underrepresented in research. I'm not going to go through this today, but this is also available for you, again, to take and adapt to your situation. Could I have the next slide? We have considered payment to research participants. We do believe the compensation is appropriate, and there are different kinds of payment types. We've used the following types, as you can see, in order to make these consistent discussion and buckets for payment, knowing that IRBs are going to review this, and you should really be differentiating reimbursement, compensation, gifts, and incentives in your consideration for that. So there are practical points to consider. And on the next slide, we've also created a 2-page guide for participants, giving them questions and answers about each of these kinds of issues that they should know and appreciate as they go into a trial, as well as with questions to ask of their study team. Could I have the next slide? Again, this is not only about race and ethnicity. We've created a accessibility by design toolkit for inclusion of people with disabilities in clinical research. That's divided into planning, implementation with communication, accessibility concerns, physical accessibility, and then newer strategies for inclusion, which specifically highlight supported decision-making as a model, and then accountability and advocacy, what you can do to bring this forward. As everyone knows, disability is now a health inequity itself and has been defined as such. Now, those are those are issues that we've brought forward for initial review and consideration. We also think it's important that each protocol at continuing review is reviewed for the demographic distribution and whether that distribution is on track to approximate the study goals. And if not, are there corrective actions described? Are they going to be sufficient and likely to be successful? This is not always easy, but the investigators all have this information and should be prepared for your continuing review. And it's a perfect time to intervene and plan for correction. We know this is tough, but when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And we can only encourage you to make these corrections at a time before the end of the study when it's too late to correct. And there are also specific closeout procedures that we can get back to at a later time. Could I have the next slide? So with that, next slide. Again, where do I start? There's a statement of commitment, the survey. We then think you should go through your policies and templates and think about changing them to be really considerate of DEIA considerations. Think through how to align the people in the institution to take this journey with you. Plan what you're going to do and communicate what you're going to do so it's not a surprise. You're not pausing protocols that have been submitted without telling people what you expect before you do so, and provide the tools that can help the communities at large do what you wish them to do. We have some, we also have participant facing materials, and we'd like to know what you want from us. Revise the best practices and then develop a business plan for change so that it's evident to the institution what you need to make this possible. And then the last is to negotiate for resources which will be necessary for change. And some of those kinds of considerations will be translators or translation and interpreters, plain language, tools and resources to help people, ways of returning results, both individual and aggregate, accommodations for your participants, and then other resource needs that you may need, such as compensation for community members. Next slide. So do tell us, please, how we can help. That's why we're here. That's why we're together. And next slide. Are just included some of the links to the trainings and the resources templates that we have available for you. This is on the IRB HRPP. Next. And these are for PIs, research teams, IRBs, and participants. We do plan to have this kind of a webinar annually, and what we'd like to do is know from you what we need to build to support your efforts, since you're the ones who have the most difficult job. Let me turn it over to Ivy and your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. So before I talk about the resources that we have available at PRIM&R, I really want to center my discussion on how PRIM&R's mission connects with our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. Next slide, please. Our mission involves advancing the highest ethical standards in research, and we consider that to involve embracing inclusion and building trust, which is central to the work that we do. We extend that into our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. We wish to ensure that everyone who benefits from ethical research has fair and equitable access to the research. And to do this, we recognize that we must address the systemic injustices that persist in our research endeavors. Our commitment to this work is grounded in who we are as PRIM&R, as an organization, which extends into our mission through our programs that we provide. and most importantly, the conversations that we facilitate that expand your knowledge and understanding and provide you the tools and resources to implement these initiatives into our broader research community and the public. Next slide, please. So I'll walk you through where you can locate a lot of our resources. And we have many resources that are free, and then we have some that are for members only. If you go to our main homepage, the PRIM&R.org page, you will see a menu section, I think to the far right, that says resources. And we actually have a DEIJ resource page. On that page, you will find, for example, here's a screenshot of some free resources that are past sessions at our annual conference. And those were focused on DEIJ work, as well as some additional resources. Next slide, please. On that same page, you'll learn about our scholarship program that we offer. We have a scholarship program geared towards smaller institutions who may not have robust oversight programs. And many of these institutions primarily serve marginalized populations, such as our historically Black colleges and universities, our Hispanic serving institutions, and our tribal colleges and universities, as well as other health institutions serving marginalized populations with significant health disparities. And I will share with you that at our PRIM&R 23 conference that was held in December of 2023, we had scholarship recipients there, and their feedback was amazing. The opportunity and the access that they were given will really help them as they continue their graduate work. Next slide, please. Additionally, on that resources page, we have, and it's complimentary, and I encourage you, particularly if you like to hear about the stories of those who've blazed the trail, who've set the foundation, we have our People and Perspectives digital library. And these include stories and experiences of diverse individuals who significantly contributed and impacted research ethics and PRIM&R. Next slide, please. So there are more resources available that are free or complimentary. And for members, we do have additional webinars, as you can see, and podcasts that are focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. Next slide. For example, we have webinars and a suite of webinars that serve as resources and guides for research conducted with American Indian and Alaska Native populations. Next slide. And really, I want to focus on our upcoming events. We have our PRIM&R 24 conference, and that's in November in Seattle. There is a webinar that we'll have in December after the conference that focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, access, and belonging. We're going to extend the conversation into understanding a sense of belonging for participants. And also, we have pending partnerships with academic, federal, and private partners to continue this important work and extend these critical conversations. But most importantly, we want to know what you need, as Barbara mentioned earlier, so we welcome your ideas and hope to hear from you. Thank you, and I'll turn it to Michelle.
Thanks, Ivy. Hi, everybody. First of all, I just want to send kudos to my incredible colleagues who have put a great deal of thought and effort into thinking about these critical issues and for creating resources for our community. I think you've seen a ton of stuff that Barbara and Ivy have already created, so I encourage you to avail yourself of those. So in addition, I'm excited to let you know about a few of AAHRPP's initiatives that are relevant to this discussion on incorporating DEIA issues into your HRPP. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a working group that we created that falls under the purview of our collaborative AAHRPP network. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some existing standards and elements that are critical to an HRPP but generally have not been addressed formally in the regulations. But our community has a powerful voice and felt that very strongly that these issues should be incorporated into regular practice. And two of them include community-based participatory research and community outreach. So So just a little bit about our collaborative AHRP network. The vision of the CAN was to bring our accredited community together to identify issues affecting HRPPs and potential solutions. And we have a bunch of activities that fall under the CAN. We have an annual conference that will be taking place in May, the day before our regular conference. So we encourage you to attend that if you're AHRP accredited. We also have working groups. And in the works, we have repository. Well, I'm going to talk about that actually a little bit later. But the goals of the CAN include leveraging the experience and commitment of accredited organizations to identify and address adverse issues that are adversely affecting human research protections. And we hope that AHRP can continue to facilitate addressing those. We also work to create a pathway for AHRP to obtain timely feedback from organizations to drive updates to AHRP documents. So for example, we can update our guidance, our evaluation instrument, tip sheets, and other educational materials such as white papers, putting on webinars, and of course our conference topics, and also providing ongoing opportunities to promote networking and sharing best practices outside of our AHRP annual conference that meets the needs of the range of accredited organizations and the broader HRPP community. Next slide, please. So specifically, in 2019, we launched the collaborative AHRP network and had our first meeting at our annual conference in that year. And one of the things that we did after that was we did a survey of all accredited organizations to find out from them what are the issues that they're struggling with the most, and identify issues that we should address that our organizations are dealing with and wanted our help with. So again, we have an annual workshop, which is a forum to discuss and disseminate and obtain input from our working group, recommendations, and from our community. And we also have, we strive to identify challenges that our organizations are facing so that we can assist in mitigating and working together to create resources that support and promote best practices for the protection of research subjects. And so far we've had 3 working groups that, again, were staffed by our community and AHRP. The first one was on reaccreditation to see ways that we can add value to the process. And then we looked at the metrics that we're collecting, mainly from our annual report, which is designed to create benchmarking information and information that you wanted to get that would be helpful to you as a community. So Michelle Cobb and Jonathan Green from NIH co-chaired that and came out with some wonderful additions and updates to our collection of what we collect from you. So, and then finally, we've launched our DEIA working group, which I'm very grateful to have Ivy Tillman and Martha co-chair with me. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. So together, both with Ivy and Martha and the members of our working group, we came up with this mission statement, which is that AHRP is committed to promoting high quality research by helping organizations strengthen their HRPPs. And this includes acknowledging that addressing systemic injustices concerning inequalities involve all parts of the HRPP. And so we've created a working group of members from AHRP accredited organizations that represent different perspectives and organization types to expand the lens on how HRPPs can impact the culture and consciousness of inclusion and equity. And we expect to create innovative and actionable ways to incorporate and broaden best practices so that inclusion and equity become the norm in our research culture rather than the exception. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit about sort of how we are going to, what our objectives and key steps are. We've already formed our working group, and again, we invited different diverse perspectives and backgrounds from our AAHRPP accredited organizations. Then we're going to be conducting an initial assessment. We're sort of in that right now, where we're evaluating current HRPP DEIA practices and thinking about how we want to proceed in terms of whether we're going to create a new standard or if we're going to incorporate these issues into our existing standards. We're looking at already what you are already doing and how is it working, and collecting tools that exist already, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel, and that we can actually use a lot of the materials that already exist. And then we've created subcommittees to generate innovative ideas and prioritize initiatives. And then we're going to think about how do we implement these things, how do we monitor them, how do we collect data to see if they're working, and also come up with metrics. And then knowledge sharing and dissemination. We want to organize educational activities to let our community, our broader community, know about these, what we've come up with, and again, publish whatever we decide that is the best way to proceed, whether that's a new standard or tip sheets or best practices. And then, of course, we're strong believers in continuous quality improvement. So we're going to review the effectiveness and solicit feedback from our community and adapt approaches to address emerging challenges, which I think we all know is a nonstop ongoing issue. Next slide, please. So we do, AAHRPP already does have some requirements that look into, that are connected to this. So as mentioned earlier, in response to the research community's prioritizing the needs for organizations to respond to the concerns of research participants, we have a standard on requiring this from HRPPs in order to become accredited. And I'm going to talk about what this looks like a little bit. And to me, this seems like one of the best areas and most appropriate areas to think about incorporating DEIA issues into our standards in terms of what they address. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go into a little detail to show you where AAHRPP has landed on responding to the concerns of participants. So we require, as do the regulations to a certain extent, organizations to provide information to current, former, and prospective research participants about whom to contact for concerns, questions, and complaints about the research, and obtain information and to offer input. And so when we think about that in the DEIA realm, when considering how to meet this requirement, we think maybe about what are the barriers that might cause some communities to be less likely to contact research organizations. Might there be benefits from different ways of contacting organizations that aren't already existing? Might who responds to the questions make a difference? So would it be helpful to have a person responding share similar backgrounds with prospective participants or current participants? Is there a budget for this? And how much does it cost to respond to these questions in ways that address the needs of our community? And because we're big in thinking about how do you measure success? Does improving how an organization responds to questions improve research participation, enrollment, or retention? So again, just some issues to think about. Next slide, please. We also have an element that requires community outreach to enhance understanding of research by participants, prospective participants for their communities and the organization. So again, areas to consider when thinking about how DEIA might affect outreach efforts. What are the barriers to participating in research and the barriers to trusting information from research organizations? I think we all have an awareness that the level of mistrust in research has grown over the past few years, so how can we address this? What are the needs of the communities in which organizations conduct research? Who are the trusted sources of information in the community, and how can we tap into that? And is there organizational support and budgets for long-term community outreach to build partnerships and community advocacy? And I think Martha's going to touch on this more as well. Next time, please. Next slide. I'm a strong believer, as AAHRPP is, that the design and implementation of research is enhanced and actually critical when individuals from the community in which the research will be conducted, and especially when people who are directly impacted by the research focus are involved in the design, conduct, and analysis of data from the research and dissemination of results. So again, these are things to think about. How do you support researchers who wish to conduct community-based participatory research? What mechanisms might be most successful? How do you provide education to communities about the design of research and dissemination of results? And what resources do IRBs and HRPPs need to develop the expertise to review community-based participatory research? Next slide. So many of you might be aware that the FDA a couple of years ago already came out with some draft guidance for the industry that addresses diversity plans to improve enrollment for participants from unrepresented racial and ethnic populations in clinical trials. And it seems like the FDA recognizes that some communities are underrepresented in research, obviously, that the sponsors must describe plans to recruit participants from underrepresented populations, and that there's a huge lack of data when it comes to unrepresented groups that may impact its decisions about when to and how to approve drugs or devices. So again, if the FDA, to me, if they say that they might not license the drug if the sponsor doesn't approve an adequate plan to recruit underrepresented groups, this is potentially a game changer for all of us. So we'll see where this takes us. Next slide, please. So my final slide, I just want to tell you a little bit about what's coming down the pipeline. We at AAHRPP strive to have organizations not have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to organizing their HRPP. And our community, as you know, has incredible depth and breadth in terms of the multitude of creative and innovative things that we address and implement policies and procedures that focus on complying with regulations and AAHRPP standards. So why start from scratch? Why not share what we do? We're so lucky that we exist in a community that's generous and collaborative, and we're planning to tap into that cooperative spirit by creating a discussion forum for accredited organizations on ways that they can share on meeting our standards and elements, and have a web-based platform for organizations to share their innovative resources, which again is forthcoming. So stay tuned on that. We will keep you updated on the progress of that. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Martha. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of boots on the ground, how this is going at an institution that does a lot of clinical research. We are an integrated healthcare system. And I just want to really acknowledge, before I talk a little bit about some of the things we've been doing, the incredible work of the MRCT and the resources that they provide. If you haven't looked at those, please put that at the top of your list to do, as Barbara talked about, and just the incredible support from PRIM&R and from AAHRPP. This is a mission that none of us, I think, can accomplish alone. And I'm just really appreciative of the opportunity to participate in REACH and continue to talk with all of you about ways we can move forward together. Next slide. So in that spirit, I think, bringing this down to the entity level, one of the things that we started right away to think about when we were trying to implement some changes was to identify who are the leaders that we would need to work with at our institution in order to move this forward. As I said, we can't do this alone, either nationally or within our own institutions. So thinking about, do you have an identified human research protection program or group that think about participants in research? And if you do, is your IRB at the table with regards to making change happen? Because that can't happen in isolation within a research organization. So identifying the key leadership and stakeholders that are needed is really critical. Next slide. So these are some of the people that we are offices that we've been working with for different projects, and you'll see that as I touch on a few of the things that we've been doing. Some of the people and entities on this list you'll probably recognize as ones that might be part of your Human Resource Protection Program if you have it, or groups that your IRB interacts with on a regular basis. But some that you might not that we've included are like our digital health or IT groups, our finance and tax office that we've been working with a lot, and human resources, as well as our data science office and our innovation team, as well as marketing and communications to work on some of our projects. So think very broadly as you think about how you might engage across your institution. Next slide. So we started out and set up a structure to work from so that we could think about all the pieces that we wanted to touch in making sure that we cover the breadth of activities that we might want to impact to change how we include and think about diversity across our system. So research infrastructure, of course, is where we put the IRB, scientific review committees, those kinds of things, our institutional policies, our funders and partnerships, and our research workforce. Education, thinking about conferences and workshops and publications and toolkits that we needed to either utilize or develop ourselves. Our participant experience program is really a key here. This is where we've put things that you might think of like community engagement, but it's broader than that to recruitment and retention of our participants, relationships that we're building and partnerships to enhance that. We also try to touch on policy, regulation, and legislation, and I'll give you a couple examples of that. And then certainly research methods and implementation, thinking about study design and protocol development, instruments and measurements that we want to make sure do not reflect any biases. And then, of course, underlying all of this, but also under research methods, is our data and analytics. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide. So specific to our IRB, just some examples of kind of baby steps that we're taking. And I think that's a hurdle we had to get over. We had all these grandiose plans, but you got to start somewhere. And so we just started to take some little steps along the way and continue to add on to that. So we really had a priority in our IRB itself to recruit diverse leadership. So I happen to have like 13 chairs and vice chairs. We really, as people retired or moved on, we really made an effort to make sure that we were thinking about equity and inclusion in recruiting new IRB chairs and vice chairs. And we've been very successful in that. And that really sets the stage for continuing to recruit a diverse IRB committee. So focus there again as not only our physicians and our other scientists that staff our meetings, but our community members. And we've been really focusing on those as well. We changed our panel so that we have 3 seats at the table at every meeting for community members, not just one, and that is our non-scientist representative. We don't allow scientific members from the community anymore. We really want people that represent our diverse community. We recruit through many different ways, but a way we have found successful is through study teams and research centers at our institution when we're continuing to utilize. And then really importantly, not relying on our IRB staff to act as our non-scientists. Again, we've really focused on making this a community position. In our training and education, and again, thanks to all of the work from MRCT that we've been able to lean on for some of this, making sure that our IRB members and IRB staff have general education about DEIA efforts, but also thinking about developing specific training for protocol review and screening, and we're working on that right now. Making this, we have made the move. We're no longer using city as our training, as our required training for our research communities. And one of the reasons we did that was to make sure that we were providing very operational training for our researchers. at Mass General Brigham. It allows us to incorporate things that we think are really important, like information about equity and inclusion in research. So we'll be incorporating that into our training, and then also offering additional optional education offerings for our researchers. Under the protocol, as I mentioned, thinking about where we need to change protocol requirements to make sure that researchers are thinking about this as they're developing their protocols, and potentially our industry sponsors as well. And then thinking about this from the budget to support equity and inclusion. Next slide. We've also been undertaking a pretty what turned out to be massive effort to change our policy on subject payments. And one of the key things we wanted to change was we had a very low bar under which we allowed our researchers not to collect Social Security numbers. So it used to be $50. Any payments above that in a study, you had to collect Social Security number from all your participants. So we went on a mission to revise that, and with input from a lot of our researchers, as well as consultations with our finance department, with our research leadership, and interestingly with our digital leadership, because we need to develop some new technology to support this, we were able to raise the limit to 250, under which our researchers won't have to collect Social Security number. And we're developing a unique ID system for tracking our participants that does not require SSN or other highly sensitive identifiers in order to track. We're also looking at increasing our options for payments, including broadening and making it easier to provide gift cards, which was one of the key things our researchers wanted to be able to do. Next slide. Translation and interpretation. This is probably one of the top things that we always hear from our researchers that they're struggling with. At Mass General Brigham, we have 6 required languages. So it can be kind of challenging and expensive to translate everything, but we're working very closely with our patient experience leadership team, who's looking at this from the clinical side to make sure that research is included in any proposals to support translation and interpretation at our institution. We're working directly with our translation offices to be sure that researchers know exactly how to get those services. We've heard concerns that research is not prioritized over clinical. So that's, a work at making sure there's sufficient resources to serve both purposes in our organization. Then we're having ongoing discussions again about translation of assessments and tools that are not validated for other languages. Next slide. A few additional initiatives, and again, this is kind of in the spirit of taking some baby steps here. Our IRB identified, and I saw in some of the comments that people are thinking about DEI from the perspective of equitable selection of subjects, and that's just what our IRB did. They were seeing, especially for device trials, that often people without insurance were being at inclusion-exclusion criteria ruled out of participating in the device trials. So we worked with our clinical trials office that manages contracting with industry sponsors and with our research leadership, and met with all of the researchers that do device studies and came up with a new requirement for our industry sponsors, requiring that they go through the Medicare coverage analysis prior to IRB approval. What was happening was many of them were just not willing to do that, or saying they would do that after the research recruitment started, which meant often that people who did not have insurance couldn't be enrolled. Working on plans to pilot providing results, aggregated results to all of our research participants through a program called Rally for All, which is a recruitment program, but we're working with the owners of the Rally for All website to place all of our research, whether they're recruiting or not, on the website so people can see what we're doing and attach results of our studies there. And then developing in the spirit of keeping track of what we're doing and seeing if we're making any progress, creating a system-wide participant registry for our participants to register under so that we can get baseline metrics on equity and inclusion and track our progress. Next slide. And finally, Barbara mentioned how important it is to think about disability, and this has been a big priority for us as well, that we think about accessibility for all in our institution. So early on, the first step we did was we joined our system-wide disability council, which was really focused on clinical activities. But by joining, we've been able to join the conversation, and now there is a subcommittee that we're part of specifically for research and one specifically for education, where we can continue to get information out to our research community about including all in research. We also partnered with our research compliance office to add disability education to mandatory responsible conduct of research training. And then in the spirit of what can we do on the policy and legal side, we supported the reversal of the NIH's working group decision. Their original decision was not to designate those with a disability as a health disparity population, which would have had made huge barriers. That decision was reversed with a lot of input from a lot of organizations. Importantly, no one with a disability was on the committee that made that decision. So that decision has now been reversed. We also submitted comments to the NIH's RFI on creating a new NIH mission statement, which much of that was around the issues of disability, and waiting to hear how that comes out. Next slide. So takeaways, as I mentioned, small steps are okay. Don't wait for the big things to happen. Collaborate with others that are doing this work in your institution, and hopefully now through REACH, and engage leadership wherever and whenever you can. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, Martha, Ivy. And if everybody could come back on, I think what we want to do really is to focus the discussion on a few of the questions that weren't answered. But I do want to encourage anybody who has ideas about what would be helpful for them in their work and in their advocacy for this consideration to put those ideas in the chat. So we're in the Q&A, and please put your questions in the Q&A as well. I also want to encourage you to reach out to any of us with those ideas, and we'll put our emails, make our emails available. So with that, let me take down the slides if we could and have a discussion. The first question that's come in from the community is, Ivy, what do you mean by belonging?
Yeah, I provided hopefully a succinct answer, but really it's a great question, because we want to extend that conversation about belonging into our research endeavors and the research enterprise. Oftentimes belonging is centered in the workplace and in academic settings, and there's a lot of research and scholarship around it. And so just to kind of clarify, it means that sense of support and security that one feels regardless of their background. It leads to those feelings of acceptance and inclusion, right? And so in the webinar, we want to begin having discussions and bringing in experts who can give us some meaningful practices on how to extend belonging and interactions with research participants.
Thank you. Thank you. Martha, just to ask, you said that you didn't have community scientists or scientists from the community.
Right.
Maybe you could explain that, and also who you look for and how you get your community members.
Yeah, so in our effort to really prioritize getting community representation and diversity on our board, and we again chose 3 of our IRB seats to be dedicated strictly to community members, and we couple that with our non-scientist membership. So we want to be sure that we have seats at the table for our non-scientists that are representing the community that we represent in the Boston and New England area. So we really want just people that, might be participants in our studies, people that really represent the day-to-day community person in the public. And typically that would not be a scientist. We have, plenty of scientists within our organization that have that scientific expertise we need. So it's a chance to really focus on the non-scientist position.
Thank you. And, just to say 3 out of your membership of 12 is 25%, right? Mm-hmm. So you're really trying to bring forward the voice of those that you emphasize serve.
The voice. Yeah. I just attended an IRB meeting this week for a very unique study we were reviewing. And I think we had, we did have our 3 community members there that were very, very important and an important voice in that review.
That's great. Thank you. So one other question that's come up repeatedly is, how do we prioritize diversity, inclusion, accessibility, justice efforts in the research enterprise when there are so many states that have made this so difficult? In other words, have laws forbidding the use of the word diversity, or that restrict the actions that we can take. I wonder, Ivy, do you want to bring up your thoughts and then open it up to others?
Sure. I think this is a great question, and it's timely, and has been. And it really, for me, it's about centering the principles associated with the work. There are places where you can no longer call it DEIJ or DEIA work, but you can still do the work. So if a principle that you wish to prioritize is access, access alone, you can find some practices where you can begin to examine systems. Start within your IRB. Are there systems and policies and requirements that impede access to the research? And I would say, listen to the researchers. Oftentimes they are telling you where the priority is and where you can start. The work can be done. We recognize that it is becoming increasingly more difficult. And that's part of our goal, is to really assist you, our colleagues, with getting this work done.
Thank you. And what we've said is, you can certainly talk about representativeness of the disease or condition. You can talk about inclusion. The challenge is getting away from either diversity as a word, race, ethnicity, which are, unfortunately now trigger words, but certainly not the work itself. Do others want to?
I was just going to add that, kind of our foundational document, the Belmont Report, is always something that I go back to, and it has this, justice, respect for persons, and beneficence, which really incorporates a lot of what we're talking about today, just in different, maybe more palatable language for those states. So, and as Ivy said, I think a lot of us are already doing that work, and it's just maybe how you're phrasing it. And I think there's a delicate balance between making sure that we don't shy away from these issues and avoid them just because they're difficult and controversial, but also being sensitive to the fact that people are really struggling and they don't want to get fired or they don't want to be put in jail. So again, we have to be really mindful of that. But for me, I always go back to the Belmont Report, and I think we can find a lot of wisdom in that document.
Thank you. So we are out of time, and I want to thank my colleagues. I want to thank the community who are here. We will do our best to continue this work, and we will certainly be back to talk to you and work with you. Please do let us know how we can help. That's why we're all here, and really appreciate everyone coming together to make this a priority in what we do and how we serve. Thank you.